The sun hanging over the valles centrales of Oaxaca in August of 1859 was not merely a source of light, it was a physical weight, a heavy golden anvil that pressed down upon the Hacienda San Rafael until the very air seemed to shimmer with exhaustion. The estate was a sprawling scar upon the dry earth, its whitewashed adobe walls gleaming with a blinding ferocity that forced field hands to squint and horses to bow their heads. It was a fortress of wealth built upon the backs of the destitute, a place where time seemed to curdle in the heat. Inside the cavernous, shadow-drenched study of the main house, the temperature was only slightly more bearable, though the atmosphere was far more suffocating. Don Sebastián Bellard stood by the heavy oak desk, a man carved from the same unforgiving granite as the mountains surrounding the valley. He watched his son, Rodrigo, with a gaze that had long ago curdled from disappointment into a cold, calcified resentment. Rodrigo sat in his wheelchair, a contraption of dark, polished wood and squeaking iron rims, positioned near the bookshelf, looking for all the world like a piece of broken furniture that his father couldn't quite bring himself to discard. The silence between them was thick with the dust of 23 years of mutual estrangement, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant, mournful lowing of cattle that represented the future Rodrigo was unfit to inherit. Rodrigo Bellard had learned to read the silence of the household as fluently as he read the French and Latin texts that constituted his only escape from reality. He was a young man of sharp angles and pale skin, possessing a fragility that seemed almost offensive in a place that demanded rugged strength. The scarlet fever that had swept through the nursery when he was 6 years old had taken the use of his legs, leaving them withered and useless, dead weight that anchored him to the chair. That same fever had reportedly burned through his brother 2 years prior, though his brother had died, and Rodrigo had committed the unforgivable sin of surviving as a cripple. He kept his eyes lowered now, studying the intricate grain of the floorboards, his slender fingers tracing the rim of his wheel. He knew his father was drinking. The sharp, smoky tang of mezcal had begun to permeate the room, signaling that Don Sebastián was brooding on the future of the Bellarde bloodline. The hacienda was a living entity that required a master, and Don Sebastián was terrified that upon his death the land would be carved up by the vulture-like cousins waiting in Puebla. Rodrigo felt the weight of that fear directed at him, a silent accusation that his existence was the greatest failure of his father's life. "I have come to a decision," Don Sebastián announced suddenly, his voice rasping like dry corn husks rubbing together. He poured another measure of the clear spirit into a clay cup, the liquid swirling violently. "We cannot go on pretending that this situation is sustainable. You are 23, Rodrigo. A man of your age should have sons running through the courtyard, breaking things, learning to ride. Instead, we have this." He gestured vaguely at the wheelchair, a dismissal that stung more than a slap. Rodrigo flinched, but did not look up. He had heard the doctor's prognoses whispered in corridors for years. The fever that had stolen his legs had likely withered his ability to sire children as well. He was, in the eyes of the medical men from Mexico City, a biological dead end. "The doctors are guessing," Sebastián continued, pacing the room with the heavy, booted steps of a man used to crushing obstacles. "They are men of books like you. They do not know the resilience of blood. I intend to prove them wrong, or at least satisfy myself that I exhausted every possibility before I sign this land away to those fools in the city. You will attempt to produce an heir, Rodrigo, and you will do it with the stock I have selected." Rodrigo finally lifted his head, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and creeping dread. The brutality of his father's phrasing, "stock," sent a chill through him that the August heat could not dispel. "Father, I don't understand," he stammered, his voice lacking the timbre of authority. "I am not married. Who would you—" Don Sebastián cut him off with a sharp laugh that held no humor. "Marriage is a business contract for equals. This is a biological experiment. I am talking about Inés. She is 32, seasoned, strong as an ox, and has survived childbirth before. If anyone can wring a child out of you, it is her." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in a well. Inés. Everyone knew Inés. She was a fixture of the hacienda, a woman of towering, quiet strength who worked the fields with a ferocity that shamed men half her age. To Rodrigo, she was a distant figure, a silhouette against the sun, possessing a dignity he could only envy. The idea of imposing himself upon her, of being wheeled into her life to use her as a broodmare, made his stomach turn over in sickening somersaults. "You cannot be serious," Rodrigo whispered, gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "She is a human being, father. You cannot simply command this." "I can command the sun to set if I close the shutters, and I can command my property to do as I see fit," Sebastian roared, slamming his hand on the desk, causing the inkwell to rattle. The veneer of civilization slipped away, revealing the desperate tyrant beneath. "Do not lecture me on morality, you who have never worked a day for the bread you eat. This is about survival. The Bilarde name hangs by a thread, and you are that thread. You will go to her hut tonight. Tomas will take you. You will return every night until she is with child, or until I accept that you are truly hollow inside." He leaned over the desk, his face flushed with drink and rage, his breath foul with tobacco. "If you refuse, I will cut off your access to the library. I will confine you to your room. I will make your life a prison within a prison. But more importantly, think of her. If you refuse, she suffers. I will send her to the sugar fields in Veracruz. You know what happens to workers there. They last 3 years, Rodrigo, 4 at most. Do you want her death on your conscience, or do you want to try to be a man?" The ultimatum was absolute. It was a trap constructed of guilt and duty, with no exit that didn't lead to suffering. Miles away from the luxury of the study, in the workers' quarters where the air smelled of wood smoke and earth, Inez was kneeling before her metate. The rhythmic sh-clack of the stone rolling over the corn kernels was the soundtrack of her life. A meditation that allowed her mind to wander while her hands performed the brutal work of survival. She was a woman etched from the landscape itself. Her skin was the color of rich, turned soil, and her eyes were dark pools that had witnessed too much death to be easily frightened. She had buried a husband who had been hanged for the crime of hunger, and she had buried 2 children who had succumbed to the fevers that stalked the poor. At 32, she was considered old by the standards of the hacienda, yet her body remained unbroken, a testament to a willpower that was almost frightening to the overseers. When the shadow of Tomas, the foreman, fell across the doorway of her small adobe hut, she did not flinch, though her heart stuttered. Tomas was a harbinger of bad news. He never came to the quarters for pleasantries. "Leave the corn, Inez," he grunted, refusing to meet her eyes, focusing instead on the dust swirling around his boots. "Don Sebastián wants you in the big house now." Inez wiped her hands on her rough-woven apron, her mind racing through the catalogue of possible offences. Had she not harvested enough yesterday? Had someone accused her of theft? But as she followed Thomas up the hill toward the whitewashed mansion, she sensed a different kind of danger. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and bleeding orange, casting long, distorted shadows across the courtyard. When she entered the study, the smell of stagnation hit her. Old paper, stale smoke, and the sharp scent of fear. She saw the young master, Rodrigo, sitting by the window, looking as though he wished the earth would open and swallow him whole. He looked pale, sickly, and utterly terrified. Don Sebastián wasted no time on pleasantries. He laid out the proposition with the cold efficiency of a livestock trade. "You will receive extra rations," the patron said, his voice flat. "Meat, milk, a watertight roof. If you bear a son and he lives, you will be granted manumission papers after the child is weaned. You will be free." The word freedom hung in the air, glittering and sharp like a knife's edge. But Inez looked at Rodrigo, seeing the humiliation burning in his cheeks, and she understood the cost. She was to be the soil in which they tried to grow a crop that had failed elsewhere. "And if I refuse?" Inez asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands which she hid behind her back. It was a dangerous question, one that could earn her a lashing, but she had to know the boundaries of her cage. Don Sebastián smiled, a tightening of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you are of no special use to me here. I have an offer from a plantation in the lowlands. They need strong backs for the cane harvest. The humidity there, it rots the skin off your bones, they say." He let the threat settle, heavy and suffocating. Inez felt the trap snap shut. Veracruz was a death sentence. Everyone knew it. To go there was to die slowly, anonymously, far from the graves of her children. To stay here meant submitting to this strange, humiliating arrangement with the crippled boy who looked at her with apologetic eyes. She looked at Rodrigo again. He wasn't cruel. He was broken. There was a difference. In that moment, she made a calculation based on survival. the only arithmetic she had ever been allowed to practice. "I understand, patron," she said quietly. "I will do as you say." Don Sebastián nodded, satisfied with his purchase. "Good. Tonight, Tomás will bring him." The night air was cool, a merciful relief from the day's oppression, filled with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of dry leaves. Inés sat on the edge of her narrow cot, waiting. She had swept the dirt floor of her hut, though she didn't know why, perhaps to assert some control over the space where her dignity was to be compromised. When the sound of the wheels approached, a rhythmic squeak thump over the uneven ground, she took a deep breath, bracing herself. Tomás appeared at the door, pushing the chair with little care, bumping it over the threshold before turning and vanishing into the dark without a word, leaving the two of them alone in the flickering light of a single tallow candle. Rodrigo sat just inside the door, gripping the wheels of his chair as if they were the only things anchoring him to the earth. He looked entirely out of place in the humble hut, his velvet jacket and clean linen shirt contrasting sharply with the adobe walls and the simple clay water jug in the corner. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, filled with the unspoken horror of their shared coercion. Neither moved. The candlelight danced on the walls, creating ghosts that weren't there. Rodrigo started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again, speaking to his hands. "I want you to know that I did not ask for this. I argued against it." He looked up then, and Inés was struck by the raw honesty in his face. He wasn't looking at her like a master looks at a servant. He was looking at her like a fellow prisoner. "I know," Inés replied, her voice softer than she intended. She stood up, her silhouette dominating the small room, and moved to close the wooden shutter against the night wind. "The patron does not ask. He takes. We are both just pieces on his board." She turned to face him fully. "But we are here now, and he expects results." Rodrigo flinched at the implication, his face flushing a deep crimson. "The doctors say I cannot," he blurted out, the confession tumbling from him in a rush of shame. "They say I'm broken inside as well as out. This is likely a futile humiliation for both of us." Inés looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the man beneath the disability and the title. "Then we have a choice," she said, sitting back down on the edge of the bed. "We can be enemies in this room, or we can simply survive it together. If nothing is to happen, then nothing happens, but we must pass the hours." She gestured to the space between them. "Come closer. I do not bite." That first night did not pass in the way Don Sebastián had crudely envisioned, with the brutal mechanics of breeding stock. Instead, it passed in a murmur of hesitant confessions that gradually built a bridge across the chasm of their social stations. Rodrigo, initially paralyzed by the shame of his own physical limitations, found that Inés possessed a kind of patience that was akin to the land itself, enduring and unhurried. They sat for hours as the candle sputtered and drowned in its own wax, the darkness of the hut becoming a sanctuary rather than a cell. Rodrigo spoke of his brother, the golden child who had died, and the crushing weight of being the defective replacement. He spoke of the library, his only kingdom, where he traveled to places like Paris and Vienna while his legs refused to carry him to the stables. Inés, in turn, offered fragments of her own history, stripping away the anonymity of servitude. She spoke of the husband she had lost to the hangman's noose, a man who died for stealing 3 sacks of grain during the drought of '54. She spoke of the silence that fills a house after children are buried, a silence so loud it threatens to burst the eardrums. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the adobe, they were no longer strangers coerced into a transaction, but 2 wounded veterans comparing scars in the quiet before the next battle. When Tomás arrived to wheel Rodrigo back to the main house, a silent pact had been formed. They would endure this together, shielding each other from the old man's cruelty. The nights that followed settled into a routine that was subversive in its domesticity. Rodrigo began to smuggle small items in the pockets of his velvet jacket, a fresh orange, a piece of white bread from the master's table, and eventually, most dangerously, pages torn from old books. "The mind is the only thing he cannot chain," Rodrigo whispered one evening, unfolding a crinkled page of poetry. He discovered that Inés, despite her lack of formal schooling, possessed a razor-sharp intellect that had been honed by the brutal necessities of survival. She absorbed information with a hunger that startled him. In the dim light, with heads bent close together, he began to teach her the alphabet. It was a treasonous act. A reading servant was a dangerous servant, prone to ideas about rights and wages. But for Rodrigo, teaching her was an act of defiance, a way to give her a weapon that his father could not easily confiscate. They traced letters in the dirt floor with a twig, erasing them quickly at the sound of any footstep outside. "A," he would whisper, guiding her rough, calloused hand with his pale, trembling one. "A for agua, for alma." In those moments, the power dynamic shifted. He was not the master's son, and she was not the grinder of corn. They were co-conspirators in a revolution of two. Yet, the shadow of Don Sebastián's command loomed over their intellectual refuge. The old man's patience was thinning. During the day, he would inspect Rodrigo with a critical sneer, looking for signs of success, asking crude questions that made Rodrigo wither. It became clear that conversation alone would not save them from the sugar fields of Veracruz. The transition to physical intimacy was awkward, fraught with the logistical difficulties of Rodrigo's paralysis and the immense emotional weight of their situation. Inés took the lead, not out of desire, but out of a pragmatic kindness. She had to help him move from the chair to the narrow cot, lifting his dead weight with arms that had hauled timber and stone. For Rodrigo, this dependence was agony, a supreme vulnerability that burned his cheeks with shame. "I am sorry," he would apologize repeatedly. "I am a burden. I am useless." But Inés silenced him, not with words, but with a gentleness that belied her hardened exterior. "You are not useless," she told him firmly, adjusting the blankets. "You are just a man who needs help. We all need help, Rodrigo. Some just hide it better." In the darkness, the act became less about procreation and more about a desperate, tender search for comfort in a hostile world. It was a slow discovery of each other's humanity, a reclaiming of their bodies from the man who claimed to own them both. A month into this arrangement, the pressure from the main house turned violent. Rodrigo arrived at the hut one evening with a dark, blooming bruise darkening his jawline and a cut above his eyebrow. He tried to hide it in the shadows, but Inés saw it immediately. She touched the swelling with cool fingers, her anger flaring hot and bright. "Your father?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Rodrigo nodded, looking away, his voice trembling with suppressed rage and humiliation. "He says I am taking too long. He says I am failing him on purpose. He threw a decanter at me." He gripped the arms of his wheelchair until his knuckles turned white. Sometimes I think about the north," he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have read about places near the border, or even across it. Places where a man can disappear and start over. Where no one cares about the name Bellard." It was a fantasy, brittle and impossible. A paraplegic aristocrat and a runaway servant crossing hundreds of miles of bandit-ridden desert. But Inés did not mock him. She listened because the fantasy was the only air they had left to breathe. "We would need a wagon," she said practically, indulging the dream. "And money, and guns." For an hour they plotted a great escape they both knew would never happen, finding solace in the mere idea of a horizon that wasn't owned by Don Sebastián. Then came the change, subtle at first, like a shift in the wind before a storm. In the second month, Inés began to feel a heaviness in her limbs that sleep could not cure. The smell of frying lard, once appetizing, now turned her stomach violently. She tried to ignore it, attributing it to the stress and the heat, but the women of the hacienda were observant. Juana, the elderly cook who had survived 3 masters and a revolution, cornered Inés by the well one morning. "Your eyes are different, girl," Juana said, her voice a low rumble. "And you walk as if you are carrying something precious." Juana didn't wait for a confirmation. She simply nodded and pressed a pouch of dried ginger into Inés's hand. "For the sickness," she muttered, before shuffling away. That night, when Rodrigo rolled into the hut, the atmosphere was charged with a new, terrifying electricity. Inés waited until he was settled, then took his hand, placing it on her flat stomach. "Juana thinks it has happened," she said quietly. Rodrigo froze, his eyes widening in shock. Are you sure?" Inés nodded slowly. "My blood has not come, and I feel different." The reality of it crashed into the room. It was their salvation, but it was also their doom. They had created a life to save their own, but in doing so, they had forged a new chain that would bind them to the hacienda and to Don Sebastián's ambition forever. Rodrigo looked at her, his face a mask of awe and terror. "A child," he whispered. "We have made a child." The arrival of Dr. Mendez 3 days later signaled the end of the secret world Rodrigo and Inés had constructed in the shadows. The physician was a nervous, bird-like man from the city, perpetually wiping sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief, his spectacles sliding down a nose slick with oil. He arrived in a cloud of dust, summoned by a note from Don Sebastián that brooked no delay. Inés was ordered to remain in her hut, but the space was invaded by the doctor's presence and Don Sebastián's looming authority. The examination was a clinical violation, conducted with the dispassionate efficiency of a man inspecting livestock for market. Inés lay on the cot, staring at the thatched roof, dissociating from the prodding hands that measured her hips and palpated her abdomen, refusing to give the men the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Outside, Rodrigo sat in his wheelchair under the brutal midday sun, banished from the room but unable to leave, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He listened to the murmurs, the rustle of fabric, and the silence that stretched too long, terrified that perhaps they had been wrong, or worse, that the doctor would find some defect that would condemn Inés to the cane fields after all. When Dr. Mendez finally emerged, wiping his hands, his expression was one of mild surprise mixed with professional relief. "It is confirmed, Don Sebastián," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still, hot air. "The woman is gravid. I would estimate 10 weeks, perhaps 11. She appears robust, and the fetal heartbeat is strong." For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself over the hacienda. Then, a slow, terrifying smile spread across Don Sebastián's face. Not a smile of warmth, but of a gambler who has just won a high-stakes bet against the odds. He turned to Rodrigo, who was gripping his wheels so hard his fingers ached. "You heard him," Sebastián crowed, striding over to clap a heavy hand on his son's frail shoulder, nearly jarring him from the chair. "The impossible has happened. Those fools in Mexico City were wrong. Even you, with all your broken parts, have managed to do your duty." He looked back at the hut with a possessive gleam in his eyes. "My blood will continue. We must ensure the vessel is protected. No more field work for her. I want that boy healthy, Rodrigo. If it is a boy, the hacienda is saved." The transformation of Inés's life was immediate and disorienting. She was stripped of her field rags and given simple but clean cotton dresses. Her diet changed from tortillas and beans to include meat, eggs, and milk, luxuries that the other workers only saw on feast days. However, these privileges came with a heavy chain. She was moved from her private hut to a small, windowless room in the service wing of the main house, ostensibly for her comfort, but in reality for surveillance. She was no longer a person, she was an incubator, a valuable piece of property that needed to be guarded against theft or damage. The other servants watched her with a mixture of envy and pity. They whispered behind their hands when she passed, calling her the patron's broodmare, unaware of the complex, fragile bond she shared with the crippled son. Inés bore the whispers with a stoic mask, but at night, the isolation was suffocating. She missed the sounds of the night wind in the palm thatch. Here, the thick adobe walls silenced the world, leaving her alone with the growing weight in her womb and the terrifying uncertainty of what would happen once her purpose was fulfilled. Rodrigo's visits became more difficult to orchestrate in the main house, where eyes were everywhere, but he was determined. He bribed maids and timed his movements to coincide with his father's afternoon siestas. When he finally managed to wheel himself into her new quarters, the relief on both their faces was palpable. But Rodrigo brought with him a darkness that eclipsed the joy of their reunion. He held a sheaf of papers in his lap, his hands trembling as he smoothed them out on the small table. "My father has been meeting with his lawyers," Rodrigo whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He has drawn up the papers for the child, and for you." Inés sat heavily on the edge of the bed, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "Tell me," she commanded, her voice steel. Rodrigo looked up, his eyes haunted. "If it is a boy, he will be recognized as a Belad, legally. He will be the heir. And you will be manumitted. You will be free. Freedom." The word should have tasted like sweet wine, but in Rodrigo's mouth it sounded like ash. "But there is a condition," he continued, choking on the words. "You are to nurse the child for 3 months. After that, you must leave. You renounce all rights. You are free, Inés, but only if you leave the child behind forever." The cruelty of the bargain sucked the air out of the room. It was a trap designed with masterful precision. Freedom for herself or a life of slavery near her child. But even that wasn't a choice, for Don Sebastián would never allow her to stay if she refused the deal. He wanted the heir, not the mother. Inés stood up and walked to the wall, pressing her forehead against the cool plaster, a low sound of anguish escaping her throat. "He buys my baby with my liberty," she hissed, turning back with eyes blazing. "He thinks he can sever us like cutting a branch from a tree." Rodrigo wheeled himself closer, reaching out to take her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "We cannot run," he said, echoing their earlier realizations. "You are watched day and night now, but we can fight him in a way he does not understand." Inés looked at him, confused. "How? He has the law, the money, the power." Rodrigo's eyes hardened, a flash of the resolve that had kept him alive through 23 years of neglect. "We have the time," he said. "We have months before the birth, and months after. We will pour everything we are into this child. We will speak to him before he is born. We will give him a spirit that my father cannot break." In the months that followed, their relationship evolved into a desperate, focused mission. They were no longer just lovers or friends. They were architects of a future they might not see. Every stolen moment was used to shape the unborn child. Rodrigo would read aloud, his voice vibrating through the room, reciting poetry, history, and philosophy, believing that the rhythm of the words would seep into the child's bones. "We are teaching him to listen," Rodrigo would say, placing his hand over Inés's swelling stomach, feeling the sharp kicks that answered his voice. "We are teaching him that the world is bigger than this valley." Inés, in turn, spoke to the child in her native Zapotec tongue, whispering stories of resilience, of the earth, of the strength required to endure storms without breaking. "You will be strong like the mountain," she would murmur in the dark, "not hard like a stone, which cracks, but strong like the root, which holds." They were weaving a protective armor of love and identity around the child, a secret heritage that Don Sebastián's cold influence could never fully erase. It was a rebellion of the soul, a quiet war waged in the nursery of the womb. The final weeks of the pregnancy descended upon the Hacienda San Rafael like a fever dream, heavy with humidity and the suffocating weight of anticipation. Inés had become a prisoner of her own body, her ankles swollen to the size of tree trunks, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the child pressed relentlessly against her ribs. She was confined to the small room near the kitchen, where the air was perpetually thick with the scent of roasting chilies and wood smoke, a sensory reminder of the domestic life she was fueling but not truly living. Juana, the old cook, became her jailer and her confessor, sitting by the bedside with a bowl of shelling peas, offering grim warnings wrapped in kindness. "Do not love him too much while he is inside," Juana whispered one afternoon, her gnarled hands working rhythmically. "It makes the letting go harder. I have seen women lose their minds when the cradle is emptied." But Inés could not obey. Every kick, every shift of the heavy weight within her was a conversation, a secret language between her and the life she had forged in the dark. Outside the door, Rodrigo kept his vigil in the hallway, forbidden from entering by propriety but refusing to leave, his wheelchair turned toward the wall as if by sheer force of will he could protect the woman and child on the other side. He looked haggard, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, terrified that the physical ordeal would kill the only friend he had ever known, or that the birth would produce a daughter and render all their suffering meaningless in his father's eyes. The labor began on a night when the sky seemed to tear open, unleashing a torrential downpour that hammered against the adobe walls like handfuls of gravel. The pain did not come as a wave, but as a serrated knife, carving Inés open from the inside. Doña Carmen, the midwife summoned from Oaxaca City, took command of the room with the efficiency of a general, barking orders for hot water and clean linens, her face a mask of professional detachment. For hours, Inés existed in a white-hot world of agony, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, knowing that any sign of weakness would be reported back to Don Sebastián. Outside, the storm raged, masking the sounds of her struggle, but Rodrigo heard every whimper, every shifting of the bedframe. He sat in the corridor, drenched by the leaks in the roof, shivering not from cold but from a paralyzing helplessness. He gripped a small wooden cross until it cut into his palm, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, begging for mercy not for himself, but for her. Just as the thunder reached its crescendo, shaking the foundations of the house, a new sound pierced the night. A high, thin wail of indignation that cut through the noise of the rain. It was a cry of life, fierce and demanding. Doña Carmen's voice rang out, triumphant and sharp. "It is a boy, and he is whole!" The door flew open moments later, not for Rodrigo, but for Don Sebastián. The master of the hacienda swept into the room, bringing with him the smell of wet wool and triumph. He did not look at Inés, who lay collapsed against the blood-stained sheets, her hair plastered to her skull, her chest heaving with exhaustion. His eyes went instantly to the small red bundle in the midwife's arms. "Let me see him," he commanded, his voice trembling with a rare emotion. He took the child, lifting him toward the lantern light, inspecting him as one would inspect a diamond for flaws. "Sebastian," he pronounced, the name falling like a gavel strike. "He will be Sebastian after me. The line is secure." It was only then that Inés spoke, her voice a ragged whisper that barely carried across the room. "Please, let me hold him." Don Sebastián paused, looking at her with a fleeting expression of transactional gratitude, then nodded curtly. "Briefly, he needs to be cleaned." When the baby was placed in her arms, Inés felt the universe narrow down to the weight of him. He was warm, slippery, and vibrating with life. She traced the curve of his ear, the tiny, clenched fists, etching him into her memory. He had Rodrigo's dark eyes, but her mouth. He was the impossible made flesh. The following morning marked the beginning of the cruelest phase of the contract, the 90 days. The agreement stipulated that Inés would nurse the child for 3 months to ensure his strength before being cast out. It was a period of exquisite torture, a slow-motion heartbreak where every sunrise brought the end closer. A wet nurse had already been hired and lived in the house, waiting in the wings like a vulture, but for now the boy was Inés's. Rodrigo was finally allowed to visit, under the guise of inspecting the heir. He would roll his chair close to the bed, watching Inés feed their son, his face filled with a wonder that softened his sharp features. "He has your legs," Rodrigo whispered one day, touching the baby's kicking feet with a tentative finger. "He will run. He will ride. He will do everything I could not." They spent those hours whispering to the infant, pouring a lifetime of advice into ears that could not yet understand. "You are loved," Inés would murmur against the baby's soft fontanelle. "You come from strength. Never let them tell you that you are only money and land. You are heart and blood." They were inoculating him against the coldness of his grandfather, planting seeds of humanity they hoped would bloom years later. As the 90th day approached, the atmosphere in the hacienda grew brittle. Don Sebastián began to hover more frequently, impatient for the transition to be complete, eager to erase the evidence of the child's unfortunate parentage. He had lawyers draft the final manumission papers, which sat on his desk like a loaded pistol. Inés stopped sleeping. She spent the nights awake, simply holding little Sebastian, counting his breaths, trying to absorb his scent so deeply that it would stay with her for the rest of her life. She prepared a small bundle of her belongings, knowing that the expulsion would be swift. On the final evening, Rodrigo came to her room, his face pale and set with a desperate resolve. He handed her a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth, a locket containing a miniature portrait of himself, painted years ago. "So you do not forget the man who ruined you," he said bitterly. Inés took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "You did not ruin me, Rodrigo. We survived each other, and we made him." She looked down at the sleeping baby, the clock on the wall ticking away the final seconds of her motherhood. "Promise me," she said, her eyes burning dry and fierce. "Promise me you will tell him the truth one day. Not the lie your father will invent. The truth." Rodrigo gripped her hand, his eyes wet. "I swear it. On my life, Inés. He will know." The morning of the separation arrived with a sterile, bureaucratic finality that felt sharper than any blade. Don Sebastián stood in the study, flanked by a notary from the city, whose quill scratched aggressively against the parchment, the sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. The document was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. It granted Inés her unconditional manumission in exchange for the total surrender of parental rights to the male child acknowledged as Sebastián Bellard. When the time came to sign, Inés did not make a simple mark as the notary expected. Instead, with a hand that trembled only slightly, she took the pen and wrote her full name, Inés María Flores, in the jagged, deliberate script Rodrigo had taught her by candlelight. It was her first act as a free woman, and it was signed with the ink of her greatest loss. The handover itself was swift. The wet nurse took the sleeping infant, who stirred but did not cry, unaware that his universe had just fractured. Inés was given a small purse of coins, the price of a son, and an hour to vacate the premises. As she walked down the long, dust-choked driveway of the hacienda, she forced herself not to look back at the high window where Rodrigo sat, watching his heart walk away. She walked until her feet bled, carrying nothing but her clothes, the coin purse, and the battered book of poetry hidden in her shawl, the only tangible proof that she had existed in that house as something more than a vessel. For 9 years, Inés existed in a kind of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the edges of Oaxaca city. Freedom was a colder, harder thing than she had imagined. It was the freedom to hunger, to freeze, to be alone in a crowded room. Yet she survived, because survival was the only craft she had ever truly mastered. She found work first as a washerwoman, scrubbing the stains from other people's lives until her hands were raw, and later as a cook in a small inn near the market. At night, by the light of a stolen candle, she read the book Rodrigo had given her over and over, until the words were burned into her hippocampus. She saved every copper coin she could, eventually finding a position in a small parish school where the priest, surprised by her literacy, allowed her to help teach the younger children their letters. She became a teacher of sorts, pouring the love she could not give her son into the children of strangers. She wondered constantly if Sebastián was happy, if he was kind, if he knew she existed. She imagined him running through the fields she used to work, a phantom limb that ached with every change of the weather. She built a life of quiet dignity, brick by brick, determined that if he ever found her, he would not find a broken slave, but a woman standing tall. Back at the Hacienda San Rafael, the boy grew like a stalk of corn in the summer rain. Tall, resilient, and unbowed, young Sebastián possessed his mother's physical vitality and his father's contemplative eyes. He ran where Rodrigo could not, climbing the ancient laurel trees and racing horses across the valley floor, his laughter echoing in the empty halls. Rodrigo kept his promise with a religious fervor. Every evening, away from the prying ears of the grandfather, he would tell the boy stories of the woman of the corn and iron. He painted Inés not as a servant who had abandoned him, but as a hero who had made an impossible sacrifice. "She left so you could be king of this land," Rodrigo would explain, smoothing the boy's dark hair. "She loved you enough to break her own heart." When the boy asked why she never visited, Rodrigo would simply say, "Because the gates are locked from the inside, mijo, but locks rust." That rust finally consumed the old regime when Don Sebastián collapsed one evening after a rage-filled dinner, his heart giving out under the weight of his own bitterness. His death was the turning of a key. The hacienda, with all its wealth and ghosts, passed to Rodrigo. The new master of San Rafael wasted no time. Rodrigo's first act was to burn the ledgers of debt that bound the workers to the land. His second was to send riders to every corner of the state with a single name, Inés María Flores. It took 2 years of searching, false leads, and dead ends before a messenger returned from the city with news of a woman teaching reading in a parish school. Rodrigo wrote the letter himself, his handwriting now steady and sure. "The gate is open," it read. "Come home." When Inés arrived weeks later, stepping off the dusty carriage into the courtyard she had fled a decade prior, the silence was absolute. She looked older, lines of hardship etched around her eyes, but her posture was regal. Rodrigo sat on the veranda in his wheelchair, graying at the temples, smiling with a relief that looked like pain. But it was the boy who mattered. Sebastián, now a lanky 9-year-old with dirt on his knees, stood by his father's chair, staring at the stranger with wide, curious eyes. He stepped forward, hesitant, searching her face for the map of his own history. "Papa says you are the strong one," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly. "He says you taught him how to read the world." Inés fell to her knees, not in submission, but to meet her son eye to eye. "I am Inés," she choked out, tears finally breaching the dam she had built so long ago. "And I have loved you every day of my life." The boy moved instinctively, bridging the gap of years and class, throwing his arms around her neck with a fierce acceptance that only children can offer. Rodrigo watched them, tears streaming down his face, knowing that the circle was finally closed. They did not become a conventional family. Society was not yet ready for a landowner to marry a former slave, but they became something stronger. A tribe of 3 survivors. Inez stayed, not as a servant, but as the heart of the estate. She and Rodrigo raised the boy together, blending the wisdom of books with the wisdom of the earth. Sebastián grew into a man who ruled the hacienda with a fairness that became legendary in the valley, a man who understood that true nobility lay not in bloodlines, but in the capacity for compassion. In the evenings, the 3 of them would sit on the veranda, watching the sun set over the mountains, the wheelchair, the rocker, and the stool forming a constellation of defied fate. They had outlasted the cruelty of their time, transforming a legacy of shame into a story of enduring, triumphant love.